First, of course, a big welcome to you. I did it. As most of you know, Margot has been working as a certified executive coach already for years, since 2005. Her specializations are training and coaching for leadership for executives at some of the world's largest global companies. She offers individual and team coaching in both English and Italian. So for those who speak Italian, you know where to find Margot, and provides intercultural training. She has worked with clients over 50 countries on 3 continents, and she herself has lived in 6 different countries. She works with all levels of executives from CEOs to first-time managers. And Margot created a leadership program which is open to all of us called Whole Leadership. Margot's passions are leadership, intercultural relations, and developing women leaders. She helps people to increase their confidence, build on strengths, and learn how to be fully expressed leaders by discovering the best version of themselves. And especially for women, Margot wrote a book, The 4 Channels. Now, what about tonight? Tonight is about working globally. Margot is an expert in team building in a global environment, and she knows team building can be difficult. Different personalities, working styles, and decision-making techniques to deal with, and add to that the cultural differences. And then it's a big complexity. If you understand a few principles about why people behave the way they do, this helps you to navigate the uncertainty and miscommunications that occur daily between people of different cultural backgrounds. And she will show us some nice examples. But there's good news. The highest performing teams have the most diversity. So it's worth an effort to try to understand different cultures and mixed cultures. The bad news, however, is that also the very lowest performing teams have the most diversity. And the difference between the highest performing and lowest performing teams is how the managers or how we manage this diversity in the team. Tonight we will learn to prevent cultural misunderstandings and how to influence people in a way that actually works.
Very good. Thank you, Anita. Please just confirm that you can hear me. Okay, great. So I see the many messages coming through on the chat window. That is excellent. I am, as Juanita said, I'm accustomed to working live in front of people and seeing their faces and their reactions. So this is a great new experience for me just to see your words tonight rather than your faces. So what I'd like to do is start by a meditation to help us get present. Because what I can imagine is each and every one of us is arriving to this webinar from a variety of circumstances. We may have work on our mind, we may have family on our mind, or who knows what else. And I just want to take a few moments to come together fully. So please, at this time, make sure that you have any distractions turned off, whether it be your cell phone or the speakers on your computer. Close the door of the room you're in. And as soon as you've done that, close down any applications that might be running in the background that might pop up with a reminder or an email notification. Make sure that all of those things are switched off. And then take a few deep breaths. And just enjoy the feeling of just focusing on your breathing for the next couple of seconds. That's all you have to do right now. Your only task. Breathe in and breathe out. A few nice, deep, full breaths. Good for me too. And as you're breathing in and breathing out, continue to relax. And picture yourself in front of your favorite body of water, whether it be a lake or a river or the ocean. And just imagine yourself sitting by the shore, enjoying this beautiful piece of nature. And with every breath, you notice the tension dripping out of your shoulders. You feel your forehead relax and your jaw relax. And now you happen to notice on your right, there's a nice basket. And in that basket, you get to put all of those cares and worries and thoughts that you brought to this evening. Just imagine placing anything that's on your mind into that basket and just gently placing the basket in the water and letting it set sail. This basket floats perfectly and it's just floating away to allow you to focus on the here and now. And when the time is right, that basket will come back to you and you can deal with those things when that happens. So notice that basket getting smaller and smaller in the distance, and you can just have a smile on your face knowing the only thing you have to do now is be here on this webinar until 10 o'clock. So when you're ready, take another deep breath, open your eyes, and we will begin. So, welcome for the second time. Thank you, Juanita, for the lovely introduction. And I'm really excited to be working with you guys this evening and to share a bit of my experience and knowledge and some theories that I have also picked up and how to apply them. As Juanita said, I have lived in 6 countries, and some people were wondering which ones those are. Those were Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, Italy, England, Thailand. Currently, I'm living in Zurich. And the reason why I got into intercultural training was because when I moved to Saudi Arabia, I was 15 years old. And I was with my parents. My father had an assignment there. And I had got the lucky chance to learn how to speak, read, and write Arabic before I went. And part of that education taught me about the religion, the culture, what to expect. And I learned all this before we arrived in Saudi. And I had such a positive experience. I carry that with me in my heart. I feel very close to the Arab world and the Middle East. And I have a special, love for that part of the world because I had such a positive experience. Then, a year and a half later, we moved to England. And the whole family, and by the way, the time in Saudi Arabia wasn't without its difficulties. Just because I knew about the cultural challenges didn't mean they didn't challenge me and my family. So when we found out that we were moving to England in a year and a half after that, we thought, oh, this will be easy. They speak English. It's going to be pretty much like America. But of course, as those of you who have traveled a lot, which I'm sure is everyone, as you know, the UK and the US are very different places culturally. And arriving there is when I really first experienced culture shock. And what I define as culture shock is a huge gap in expectations. So I expected things to be very easy, very similar to the US. And when there were big differences, I felt shocked by that. And I didn't know, I wasn't prepared emotionally or mentally for those kind of differences. And that's what was the discomfort. That's what led to some frustration, some sadness, feeling of being lost, feeling of being misunderstood. So when I saw the difference between the impact of having had intercultural training and not having had intercultural training, I thought this is something that I want to share with the world. I want to help people really get the benefit of having some training before they go to a new place so they can take advantage of all the differences and really enjoy the enriching experience. So here we are. What I would like to hear from you is, what is it like to work with multicultural or global teams? And I'm going to invite you now to just type some words in the message box, just a few words. You don't have to do a full sentence. What is it like to work with multicultural or global teams? I see exciting, challenging, enriching, love it, challenging, inspiring, frustrating, thank you for the honesty, stimulating. I'm looking for the whole spectrum here. Confusing, there are misunderstandings. Right, it's like somehow it seems to be extreme, right? It's either really positive and enriching when things are going well, or really frustrating and full of misunderstandings when they're not. I see challenging for getting understood. Thank you very much for your contributions. Yeah, absolutely. And the question is, you know what? It's not you. It's not you that causes that. And it is you. And what I would like you to do now, I'm going to show you an image. And what I'm going to ask you to do, again, typing in the box, is just write down, what do you see? You don't have to get it right. There's no right or wrong. What is just the first thing that pops into your mind when you see this image? Type that in the box. Pink, construction site, building, construction, chaos, teamwork, people, builders, man working. Keep it coming. This is great. People working together. Yeah, so people building together. So we trust. So we see a whole spectrum of different things. Yeah, everything from teamwork to chaos. And the question is, who's right? Right? So it's a team attempting to come together, someone else writes. So it's a question of how do we see the world, right? We all see the world through our frame of reference. We don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And that's why we have so many different answers to that question. What do you see? We could all be looking at the exact same picture and actually come up with completely opposite opinions about what we're looking at. It's so enriching to work with different teams, but that is also what causes it to be so frustrating. So the idea today is also to understand what exactly is my frame of reference and how is it coloring the world? What kind of lens am I looking through when I do look at the world? And what kind of lens might my team members be looking through? And hopefully this information is valuable and applicable, whether you're the manager of the team or whether you're a peer in the team. Or even if you're not working in a team, hopefully this stuff is useful for your everyday interactions with the world. Understanding our frame of reference is the first step in intercultural awareness. So what we see when we have these global teams is, of course, behaviors, right? We have this lovely iceberg model, and it shows us that what we see is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of stuff driving our behavior that is invisible, and you can't hear it, you can't see it, and it's really important to understand what is it that drives our behavior. So a few of those things: beliefs, values, and needs. And it's really interesting when you start digging down to understand what is the belief behind someone's behavior, because it's incredibly strong. For example, I have a glass of water in front of me. If I believe this water is clean, I'll drink it. If I believe for some reason that it's tainted or dirty, I won't drink it. It actually doesn't matter what the truth is, it matters more what my belief is, right? This is the strongest driver for my behavior. Okay, values, needs, and beliefs are the strongest drivers of our behaviors. So when we look at differences in how people from different countries behave, we have to understand what do they believe is true? What are their values? And when I say values, I mean, what do they find important? What do they value in life? And what are their needs? Do they differ? I think that people's needs generally are quite universal. Their beliefs are so different. Every single individual has different beliefs. And the values piece is the one that we want to look at today as part of culture, because this is a lot of our values come from our culture, and we might realize that and we might not. So what exactly are values? I want to make a distinction here, because we have personal values and we have cultural values. Personal values are things, well, I can share some of my own values. And these, by the way, are some of the reasons why I just love living in Switzerland, why it's such a good match for me as far as a country. So one of my values is quality. I absolutely love having high quality items around. I have a really fancy, expensive microphone in front of me right now because I want to have a high quality audio for you guys. And in Switzerland, there's this same value around quality as those of you who live here might have noticed. Another value of mine, beauty. It makes me happy. It fills me with energy. It makes me positive when I'm surrounded by beautiful places, beautiful people, beautiful art, beautiful design, beautiful clothes, beautiful colors. That for me, it just makes me feel better when the space that I'm in is beautiful. Even a tidy room is important to me. Nature, peace and quiet, languages, interculturalism. These are all values of mine. And like I said before, you can see how my decision to live in Switzerland was very much a values-based one. So it's interesting for you to reflect on some of your own personal values. And I want to give you a little bit of time to do that. And just to think for yourself about what are those kinds of things that fill you with energy as opposed to those kind of things that drain you. Some of them may be cultural, we'll see that later, but first I want you to take a few minutes and write down for yourself about what your own personal values are. And later you can add to that what we think your cultural values are. And of course, if you have questions, please feel free to add them to the box at any time. I'm just going to give you about a minute now.
I just step in just for people to know. You can send a message to all, but you can also send a message to Margot. Yeah, you can select. Yeah.
That's
At the bottom of the chat box, you can select if you want to send it to all or to Margot. And I can imagine that maybe some questions you don't want everyone to see that question is from you. Feel free then to select moderator.
That's right. That's up to you.
I will mute myself again.
Okay, thank you. And now we're going to start looking at some cultural value scales. And there are an enormous number of different scales that we can look at. And we're going to focus on 3 today. All of the cultural experts that you may have read in the past, Fons Trompenaars, Craig Storty, they all categorize cultures based on where they lie on a spectrum, and they call those value scales. The 3 that we're going to look at today are Universalism versus Particularism, Monochronic versus Polychronic, and low power distance versus high power distance. And of course, I'll get into the definitions here in a moment. So the first one we're going to look at, Universalism versus Particularism. The scale here, the 2 ends of the spectrum here, are going from those cultures that are very dominated by rules versus those cultures that are more dominated by relationships. So you can see in the image, the ones on the left are more kind of logic-oriented, brain-oriented, and the ones on the right are more, let's say, heart-focused. So the question is now, universalism, that's a kind of culture where the laws apply to everyone all the time, no matter what. It's universal. If we have a law, it's a law, it's the law. No questions asked, very objective. Particularist cultures, on the other hand, those laws apply in particular situations and other situations maybe not. So it's much more subjective. For example, Switzerland. Which one do you think Switzerland is? And I'm sure everybody who knows is laughing and saying, yes, I'm sure Switzerland is universalist culture, because here it is not only that all the laws apply to everybody all the time, but people actually enforce the laws for each other. You know, there's personal policing of certain laws here. Particularist cultures can be a country like Italy, where I lived for 8 years before I moved to Switzerland. And for example, living there, I started becoming a bit particularist myself. We had a construction site in my little town, and they had one of these contraflow traffic lights where, because the road was only one lane, only one direction of traffic could flow at a time, and they had traffic lights controlling which direction went when. And I remember one day pulling up to the red light, and I could see that there were no other cars coming because I knew the road, and I had a passenger that was from out of town, and I just went right through because that's what everybody does. And I knew that it was safe. And the person next to me said, "You've gone native, Margot." So this is a small example, a funny example of how that might play out. But it also has big implications when it comes to how your team responds to company culture, compliance, different rules. So what I'm going to do now is give you an opportunity to determine whether you think you personally maybe lay on the universalist side or the particularist side, because we may or may not share our national culture's values, right? It's likely, when we talk about intercultural training, we generalize. We say generally people in Switzerland are universalist, or people in Italy are particularist. But of course, each individual is unique. So I'm going to ask you to consider yourself first, and then we'll look at the national level, or the national culture level. So here's a little quiz. Go ahead and read it and decide how you feel about this. I'm going to ask you a question about this paragraph in a second. Here's the question. So choose A, B, or C for yourself. You can just take note for yourself. And now choose D or E. Tell me if I'm going too fast. Okay, so you should have 2 letters for yourself. If those two letters were the top, A or B plus D, probably you lean toward the particularist side. And if you lean towards C or B and E, probably you lean toward the universalist side. So I have an interesting question coming through. It said, on the job side in Switzerland, there are private contracts and no universal rules. You can be fired any day. For people from the EU, this is very non-universalism. That's it. That sounds like it might be the case. And actually, I think that's more a question of individualism versus collectivism, because the rules are not universal as far as who gets to be fired or not. However, everyone in Switzerland agrees that it's up to the companies to decide that. So that part's universal. The fact that people don't get protection from the government shows that Switzerland is a very individualist culture as opposed to a collectivist culture. And individualist means every man for himself. Collectivist means we're all in this together and we need to help each other and protect each other. Yeah, I hope that clarifies. Thanks for the question. So now you have your own idea of where you may lie on this spectrum, and I want to show you some survey results of how people from different countries answer that exact same question. This was a survey done by Fons Trompenaars and his partner Hampton Turner. So this is not an exact science, right? So you can see more or less, maybe you can find your own country there, countries that you've lived in or know about, or your team members' countries. This is an approximation, more or less, right? So it's just fascinating to notice. You see at one end of the spectrum, very universalist, Switzerland, USA, Sweden, UK, Netherlands. And down at the other end of the spectrum where it's more particularist, South Korea, Russia, China, India. Interesting. If Italy was there, it'd probably be up there too. Where would I put Saudi Arabia? Interesting question. Saudi Arabia. I would actually put Saudi Arabia more on the particularist side. I mean, it happens. It's the reason why I paused is because it happens to be a very strict culture, and so because the penalties are so high for the enforcement of the rules, that might make it seem quite universalist. But in reality, if you have the right connections and you know the right people, and you have a good sponsor, then you can get past certain regulations. That was a question, great question from the audience. Thank you. All right, so here are some more countries on a different format of the spectrum. So you can see some, the US, Germany, UK down at one end, Japan and France more in the middle, India, Russia, China on the. So this is just looking at the same data in a different format. And here's some tips when leading team members. So as you're going through this, I hope that you're also reflecting on the people you work with and which side they may lay on. So I'm just going to give you a minute to absorb this information and find out if you have any questions. I especially love the middle points there. In the Universalist culture, there's a get down to business attitude. And people from particularist cultures might find that rude. Or somebody who's kind of pushing you to accept something. That's normal in universalist cultures. Particularist cultures find that to be pushy, to be cold. Whereas on their side, get to know you small talk is like, it's just it's what you do. It's part of the process. You can't just start without that. And it's not that you need to take it completely personally. I know that some people find that very surprising, that in a business context, another person may open up and start sharing quite personal things and encourage a personal small talk discussion. But that's just par for the course. The more particularist the society is, the more normal that feels and the more necessary, actually. That one at the bottom, carefully consider personal implication of your legal safeguards. Those of us from Universalist culture think it's a good idea to make sure all the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, and every detail is in the contract. And we're not saying that the people are untrustworthy. That's not what we want to express. But somebody from a particularist culture might take it that way, saying, why are they being so careful and so strict with everything? Are they, don't we have a relationship here? So it's interesting to think about the impact of your actions. All right. Any questions so far? All right. Our next value scale, our next cultural value scale kind of has a funny name, monochronic versus polychronic. And by the way, I just got a comment from the audience. Thank you for this. This person said that she experienced such a negotiation with Swiss people and found it very hard. Right? So it's interesting to look through this lens, and you can kind of see what's maybe looking back on that negotiation. Perhaps you can understand. You still hasn't recovered. I'm sorry to hear that. Sometimes intercultural interactions can really be very difficult and evoke a lot of tough emotions. Yeah. So I hope that this has helped you reflect and look at it through a different lens today. Thank you for the comment. So the second cultural value scale, monochronic ranging to polychronic. Sounds kind of funny. Monochronic, basically what we're talking about is time here. In a monochronic culture, we find time limited, valuable, time is money, and you should do one thing at a time, or it's best to do one thing at a time. In a polychronic culture, time is limitless. We're not so fixated on time. People are never too busy to say hello or to, stop and do something. And it's definitely not necessary to finish one thing before starting another. It's like everything at once is kind of okay. So again, you can think of, countries that I've mentioned already, Switzerland versus Italy, et cetera, or certainly US or Japan, monochronic, Germany. Well, here's an example from my own life. Germany, I do a lot of work there. I have several clients there. And one time I went to a meeting that was supposed to begin at 3:00. I walked into the meeting at 3:00. I knew I was on time. I was happy with that. And everyone was already seated around the table. And the head of the meeting looked at me and he said, "Margot, if you could please be on time. We start our meetings on time. Punctuality is important this week." And I had a smile on my face because I thought, oh, that's funny. I thought I was on time. And I turned around and I looked at the clock and it literally was 3:00 and 30 seconds. And when I saw that, I started laughing because I thought he was kidding. And I turned around and I looked at him again and he was not smiling. He was looking at me like, I'm serious. And I thought, okay, 30 seconds, that's late. That is late around here. This is a monochronic culture. So time and being on time is relative. And it's really important, especially with your team members, to talk about when I say, please be on time, what does that mean? For some people, that means be in your seat 5 minutes early, ready to go. For other people, that means 10, 15 minutes after the start time is fine. The places with a lot of traffic, places with polychronic cultures. I remember in Saudi Arabia, they would stop for prayer time several times a day. And it's, you're waiting in line at passport control to enter the country and you hear the call to prayer. And all of a sudden the guys in the passport booths just leave. They go and pray. That's the most important thing at that time. Time is limitless. They're not worried about the passenger's time. There's priorities are different. And once you get accustomed to that and become relaxed about that, and you learn to plan ahead and you learn to allow for lots of extra time, it doesn't frustrate you as much. But if you expect everything to happen one after the other, one thing at a time, and then multiple things are happening at once, it can lead to huge frustration. So here's a beautiful graphic example of how monochronic versus polychronic cultures work. Imagine there are 6 customers in this shop ready to pay. And if each one is representative of a circle, how should they arrange themselves vis-a-vis each other? So where would the people stand around this counter if they're waiting to pay? Now, if they're in a monochronic culture, it's going to look one way. In a polychronic culture, different way. So you see in the top, I apologize for the low quality graphic. In a monochronic culture, people will naturally line up. You might have seen this in England, in the UK. They say people are born knowing how to queue. Also in Switzerland, US. Down at the bottom, polychronic, that looks like the bar in Italy, definitely. My father liked to call it the point and radius method of lining up. And if you're used to one, the other one is really annoying. And it's just recognizing, okay, this is part of the value system. It's not, I shouldn't take it personally. It's not about rudeness or anything else. It's just part of the values. So here's some examples of, I see a comment in the meantime. I understand things better in France that I could not stand. I'm glad to hear that. So, as my computer is catching up to me, I'm not quite sure what happened with the freezing. What I'll let you know is you can probably already guess what are some of the countries on the monochronic side versus the polychronic side. Over on the left side, the monochronic side is the US, UK, Germany, Japan is also on that side. Then you head over to the polychronic side and you see countries more France, Italy, China, Southeast Asia, India. So that's kind of the range there. Let's see, question. That's perfect time for questions. Thank you. Can't you be monochronic and still be asked to do several things at the same time? You mean, can you be in a monochronic culture and still be asked to do several things at the same time? Certainly, I mean, especially knowing the time and place that we live in now, we're all being demanded to do a lot. She's referring to companies, she said. So in this day and age, I think we're all asked to do more than one thing at the same time, that's for sure. But I think there's still a fundamental belief behind it that it's best to do one thing at a time. Focus on one thing, finish it, start the next. That's, even though the demands of today's society ask us to multitask, whether we're in a monochronic or polychronic culture, there's still the belief behind that's interesting.
Margot?
Yes, Juanita.
Margot?
Yes.
Maybe try to click with your mouse a few times on your presentation and then use the arrows on your keyboard.
You are magical. Very good. Thank you, Juanita, my savior. Here we go. So here's some tips. I'll give you a minute to absorb. I am still there. I'm just letting you read. Thank you. The interesting thing, if you look on the right, polychronic, ignoring people, not schedules, is the greater error. That's a big difference, right? Yeah, some in monochronic cultures, it's more about the recent performance. That's the major issue. They're really a big focus on the recent performance, whereas in polychronic cultures, it's more about the whole history, the story, the context, especially now if you start blending these two value chains that we've already looked at, not value chains, value scales that we've already looked at. You can imagine in a polychronic culture that also happens to be particularist, employee valuations are going to look very different, right? They're going to look at the whole history, but they're also going to look at the context, at their whole life, at are they going through a hard time, are they not? Whereas in cultures that are purely universalist and monochronic could be like, no matter what, this is what we're looking at. No matter what happened, it's the here and now that's important, and the recent performance. And the comment from the audience, relationships with supervisors, always important. That's true. This is, like I said before, we're definitely generalizing here in order to understand these different value scales, and each and every unique individual will be different. I have a question coming in. Isn't a polychronic environment also one where there is a much smoother transition between business relationships and friendship? Absolutely. Yeah, especially when you're looking at polychronic cultures that also happen to be particularist. Yeah, there's the stronger association with heart over head, right? Relationships over task. That's for sure. Yep. Yeah, and you find, actually, that's an interesting point. I find often I hear my clients in Germany say, I really make a big distinction between business and friendship. I use formal language with my employees. I don't go, I don't talk about my personal life. I don't go out for beers with them. And I find that in other countries that maybe are more polychronic, that's not the case. In fact, they do have a more blend between the personal and the private. So the third value scale that we're going to look at, and this is the last one for tonight, even though, of course, there's so many, I would love to keep going with all of them. This is about power distance. Low power distance versus high power distance is talking about the importance of hierarchy. So on the left-hand side, we see low power distance cultures. That's what I wrote is eye to eye. So no matter if it's my boss or my employee, I still view them as an equal. I still kind of talk to them comfortably, maybe even in your language. If you have a kind of language that distinguishes between formal and informal speech, you might use the informal quite easily with people even at work. And high power distance cultures, that's where hierarchy is very, not only is it important, but it's very clear. It's very, it's almost tangible. Who is where in the hierarchy? And that's people really pay attention to that. And going back to the question of languages, if you have a language that uses formal or informal parts of speech, for sure they would use the formal parts of speech in the workplace, especially with their boss. An additional interesting thing is the higher power distance culture a country has, oftentimes you'll notice that their language contains even more types of speech that create formality. Like I heard that, for example, in the Korean language, there's not just like in German, we have the du and the sie, or in Italian, the tu and the le, or in French, tu et vous. In Korean, they have something like 5 different levels of formality in their language, and that's a direct reflection of the high power distance that they have in that culture. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why I love studying languages, because it gives you an insight to the culture as well. So I'm just reading a comment here about the last value that you guys feel free to read as well. Let's keep going. Low versus high power distance. So here's the question that people ask in order to determine, is this a low power distance culture or a high power distance culture? How important, or is it important for a manager? So they did a survey. Aperion Global asked people from many different nationalities. I'll show you the results here. So you see all the way to the left. The study was done by André Laurent, exactly. The countries that said absolutely yes, a manager better have precise answers to what the employees ask them on the right-hand side of the screen. So that's India, China, Italy, Mexico. Those are examples of countries where you have a high power distance. Over on the left, Sweden, USA, Netherlands, UK, Australia. In those countries, the people responded to the survey by saying, no, it's why should they have precise answers? They're also learning. They might be open to understand something new. Power distance data for different countries in Africa was asked. I actually don't personally have any data for power distance countries in Africa, but I bet there's a huge variety. I wish I could speak with authority on that. It's a great question, and I'd be happy to look into that. Feel free to ping me externally also by email for that question about African countries. I'd be happy to do some research and get back to you if you write me. And I also see a question here about high power distance Switzerland. What do you guys think? I think that there is less formality in Switzerland compared to Germany, but there is a power distance. Yeah, I think it's less than in Germany, but I'd be really interested to hear your opinion about that. Some graphs are yellow, others are brown. There's no particular meaning behind that. That's just because the words are at the bottom because there wasn't enough space at the top. It's just a bad graphic, frankly. So I'm going to keep moving here and think about for yourself, what is your personal value? Do you feel more like you're on the side of the low power distance or the high power distance? And here are some, again, this is an approximation adapted from Story and Hofstede of where they find certain cultures to lie on this scale. And again, we have some tips for team members. And I'd like to apologize that we don't have a full scale of every single country on here. Of course, it'd be fascinating if we had all that data, but we can make a guess. I think together when you have some knowledge about what these values mean, it becomes easier to guess. So I heard a comment that she's saying, yes, in Zurich, we do have high power distance, although it's less in the French part of Switzerland. Another comment said that there's less power distance in Germany, but perhaps higher in masculinity, right? So she's referring to another cultural value scale, which is talking about the difference between femininity and masculinity, which is, by the way, another fascinating scale. So I'll just give you a minute to. This is an interesting one that has applied to me. On the upper right hand, when you see under high power distance, it says, know that potentially challenging questions asked in a group setting can be seen as aggressive. Can be seen, and not definitely, but it could be seen as aggressive. And that's interesting for me as a coach and leadership development trainer, where I base almost all of my work on questions in group settings. And I do work with people from all over the world, as Juanita mentioned. Last week, I was running a program in Mumbai where I had people coming from all over Asia. So anywhere from Egypt to Japan to Korea. And in those kind of settings, when you have really wide range of nationalities and cultures, it's so important to let people know up front what to expect. All I had to do was say, this is the kind of environment where I'm going to be asking questions. You may not have the answers right away. And that's exactly the point. We want you to think. We want to ask you things that you don't know already. And just by saying that, I had a participant come to me and say, thank you for letting me know about that, because I participated in this training much more than I would normally, because I understood that was the point. So sometimes just a few sentences about what to expect can help get the best out of an intercultural team. And that's why it's so important to understand your own frame of reference. If I didn't realize that what I was doing might cause some discomfort with people in the room, cultural-wise, I wouldn't have thought to explain that expectation. So if you're not sure, ask for feedback. Ask people, let them know that you understand potentially you might do something that in their culture seems odd or strange or doesn't help them be at their best, and you're really curious to adapt. And therefore, I find most people are quite open to that when you ask them for feedback. Where were the cultural power distances developed? And I apologize if I missed some questions. They're coming through quite quickly if I missed some of them. Where were the cultural power distances developed? Oh, you're talking about the data that I have there. Yeah, these are, I always have the source at the bottom. They come from a variety of books, and I have a list of books at the back of this, at the very last slide of this presentation. You can look that up yourself. And the thing is, Karina, with these pieces of information, it's so subjective. It's not an exact science. Most of it comes from surveys that are done. For example, asking the kind of questions that I asked about the car, if you're driving the car with your friend who was speeding, they ask those kind of questions to thousands of people from different nationalities. And based on the way they answer those questions, they then put up these cultural scales. So by no means is it an official exact science to say, yes, Germany is exactly here. So it's more interesting as a kind of a comparison to say, all right, maybe this is something that I should be aware of here or there. And I can imagine that there's some places where you say, wait a minute, this isn't quite right. And for every country, people are going to say, oh, well, that might be the case in Bavaria, but it's not in northern Germany, or in the French part of Switzerland, but not here. We can start looking at microcosms, but this is really just a generalization for understanding. Okay, moving right along. I'm going to play you now a clip of a movie called Outsourced. And this is a great movie, kind of a fish out of water movie, where an American manager is sent to India because they're about to outsource his call center. So he's sent to India to train the new call center manager, which is the man driving the car. The guy in the back seat is the American manager who's sent over there, and he has had absolutely no intercultural training whatsoever. So what I'm going to invite you to do now as I play this video clip is to just pay attention to what you see and take on board. Clearly, a lot of you have already done some intercultural training. You know about other cultural value scales. Please feel free to bring in all the knowledge that you have, not just the 3 that I mentioned, and notice which cultural values are kind of clashing in this video. And we'll talk about that in a moment.
You like India? Bombay was a little crazy, but Garpur looks different. I don't know, cleaner. Bombay is terrible. Terrible. Karapuri is very clean. Do you have a business card, Mr. Toad? Yeah, Todd. Please call me Todd. That's fine. Okay. Executive Vice President of Marketing and Order Fulfillment. Very impressive. Not as impressive as it sounds. What I really do is sell kitsch to rednecks. Now I have to train some other schmuck to do it. May I ask a question? Yeah, go ahead. Would you kindly be telling me what is kids and what is redneck and what is schmuck? Kitsch is garbage that people buy. Redneck basically means farmer. Farmer. And schmuck? Oh, that means like a nice guy. So you're the person I'm here to train? I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. I'm so very fortunate to be learning the ways of American business from you, Mr. Toad. Todd, please, just call me Todd. Your first trip to India? Yes. Some foreigners who come here do not experience it well. But I can tell, you are of a different breed. A very good traveler. Strong and ready for anything and everything. It's very kind of you. Why do you say that? Most foreigners cannot eat gola without becoming very ill. How far is the hotel? Your reservation is for the Gharapuri Palace Hotel, but that place is very lonely. I'll take you to Auntie G's guest house. She will take care of you better than your own real mother. No, actually, I think I'd like to just go to my hotel. I'm tired of traveling. Please, Mr. Toad, I insist. We go to Auntie G's. She has a very good garden, most excellent Indian cook, very hygienic. You'll not be lonely there, I'm telling you. Okay, fine, I'll check it out. Just make it quick. You're a schmuck.
Okay, great. So I hope you can still hear me. Good, you can hear me. That's wonderful. So what cultural values did you see at play there? So yeah, use of slang. Yeah, so that's about frame of reference, right? Power distance, communal hierarchical, exactly. Relationship versus task, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, frame of reference also about the cleanliness. You know, he said, "Oh, Garapur is very clean," and then you looked out the window and there was a guy urinating on the wall. I don't know if you could see that there. The slang, the different way of looking at the world. You saw the way that the driver reacted to the business card, the title on the business card. He said, "Oh, you're very wonderful, very important title." And Todd, the American guy, said, "Yeah, it's not that great. Like, it's no big deal. It doesn't actually mean anything." Relationship versus task, someone mentioned, indeed. You know, the American guy just wanted to get to the hotel and he was just, making conversation to be polite. Whereas the driver, the future call center manager, really was, asking him a bit about him. And in fact, he does even more in the rest of the movie. I can highly recommend that movie. It's very entertaining. Good. So I just wanted to have some fun and give you a chance to see how many, in a 2-minute clip, how many different cultural value scales can be listed. I saw someone also added communal, and that's a great point. It's actually one of the value scales. That would have been the next one that I would include if I was going to include 4, this cultural scale between individual versus collective. As I mentioned before, Todd, the American, just wanted to go to his hotel, and the Indian, his host, said, "Oh no, you'll be very lonely there. I'm going to take you to Auntie G's guest house. She'll cook you nice food. You won't be lonely." Because from his point of view, it's great to be together with other people, and that's much more important than being individual. So that's that's something that was a big difference there too. Okay, moving along. What I'm going to do now is have a look at some of the work that we do with teams in the leadership development training programs that I do. And there's a model that I find extremely effective. It's really important, really useful and practical, made by Patrick Lencioni. He was looking at what are the typical dysfunctions of a team that get in the way of getting to the best results. And it's something that builds on itself. It is what he says, the primary dysfunction is the absence of trust. And when there's an absence of trust, there's a fear of conflict. Because if you don't trust that you're allowed to put your real opinion on the table, then you won't. If you feel that if you have the one minority voice or a conflicting opinion to someone else, that you'll have bad repercussions, you're going to keep it to yourself. So before people will share their real opinions, there needs to be trust. And before people are able to commit, they have to be able to share their real opinions. So that's why it's so important to have conflicts of ideas to be allowed in a team, so that people can really be committed. Because if everyone has said all of their concerns and all of their opinions, then they can take that step to be fully committed. Otherwise, it's only going to be compliance. And if you don't have commitment, then people are not going to hold themselves or each other accountable, because they're going to say, well, I didn't want to do this in the first place, but nobody cared about my opinion, right? So you need to have the trust so people are willing to put their opinions on the table and have conflict. You need to have conflict in order to have deep commitment. And in order to have accountability, you need to have a commitment. And if you don't have any of those, how can you ever get to results? If people are not holding themselves or each other accountable for what they've committed to, of course, there's going to be some inattention to results. I'm not saying there'll be 0 results. Of course, people still manage to get to some results, but there will be an inattention. There's going to be a lot of time and energy wasted on avoiding accountability, on avoiding conflict, and energy gets drained. So the best thing to work on in any team, whether it's a global team or not, is how much trust do we have? How much are people willing to actually put their opinion on the table? And what can I do to make sure that I'm role modeling that, making sure that I'm willing to put my opinion on the table no matter what, and encouraging others to do so and rewarding others for doing so? So we're going to look at that as the foundation of what we need, is this building trust. The question is, of course, how does culture impact trust in a team? It's already hard building trust in a monocultural environment. So the question is, what do you take into consideration? Trust is such a delicate little thing. It's so valuable and can grow if you take care of it. I have a question coming through from the audience. Does trust relate to feeling safe? Absolutely. Absolutely. We feel, when I'm talking about trust in this sense, it's like trusting that I'm allowed to say what I need to say, trusting that I'm not going to get kicked out, trusting that nobody's going to stab me in the back, or do something to harm me or block me. Absolutely. Feeling safe is very closely linked. So building trust, one method of building trust, or one model of looking at how to build trust that I really enjoy and that my clients really like, probably because a lot of them are engineers and accountants, they like equations. This is the trust equation, and developed by a man named David Meister and his colleagues. And I like this way of looking at trust because it's an opportunity for you to self-reflect on how are you doing in creating these 4 factors. What Meister said was, in order to create trust, that is, for people to trust us, we have to show that we're credible, that they can believe in what we're saying. They have a reason to believe us. That's what credibility is, some kind of authority. In order to have trust, you also have to show that you're reliable, that you'll do what you said you're going to do. People can rely on you to be consistent and to walk the talk. And the third thing, and this is one that a lot of times people forget to consider, especially in a business environment, is intimacy. And when he says intimacy, he's not talking about romance. We're talking about letting people know who you really are. It's about being authentic. It's about being interested in other people and letting them be interested in you, and being willing to show a bit more about what's going on underneath the surface of the water for you. So what are your beliefs? What are your values? What are your needs? I'm not saying you have to be best friends with everybody. This is different than friendship. Although you may, friendship, let's separate that. You can show intimacy without becoming friends with people. It's a question of letting them see who you are, letting them know what's important to you, right? So Meister says it's really good to increase all of these, to build credibility, build reliability, build intimacy. And the one underneath the bar is called self-orientation. And the reason why it's underneath the bar is because he says this is like a divider. It's a denominator. The higher our self-orientation is, actually the lower trust is. So self-orientation means I'm more worried about myself than I am about you or the team or anything else. I'm really focused on my own benefit, my own gain. And as you can imagine, of course, if we ever get that sense that someone else is more concerned about themselves than anybody else, then the trust goes down. So Meister says, look at those 3 on the top. We want to build those. Ask yourself honestly, what are you doing that shows credibility, reliability, intimacy? And what do you do that may be perceived as self-orientation? Because this is all about perception, right? Do people perceive you as reliable? Do they perceive you as... Because you might have a really good intention and you do your best to be reliable, but you may accidentally be setting an expectation that you're not meeting. Good questions coming through. Let me just take a second to address those. The question is, wouldn't this, and I think she's talking about intimacy, wouldn't this be contradictory in a culture such as Germany? It's a great question. So earlier I was saying that I found that my clients in Germany really like to make a clear division between business and personal. And I think that that's exactly the trap they fall into, right? They think that in order to be professional and build credibility, they better separate those things. And they get in trouble in the sense that they don't realize that they can show intimacy without becoming friendly. Like I said before, you don't have to make friends with people to be intimate. It's just about showing more of who you are and why you believe what you believe. Even just showing your opinions more often. Good. So we want to increase those things at the top. We want to lower the thing at the bottom, the self-orientation. And now, of course, we're going to look at how culture impacts that. So like I was saying a moment ago, it's about perception. Trust is about meeting expectations. So if I expect you to do something and you do it, then I find you reliable. If I expect you to do one thing and you do something completely different, then I'm going to be a little bit thrown off. I won't know if I can really trust you because you feel a little bit unpredictable. How can we turn this around? Yes, we're gonna get there, absolutely. So let me see what this comment says. How does trust intimacy relate to Ausländerfeindlichkeit in Switzerland? I don't know what that word means. Statements that you come from a different culture. Is that, you'll have to help me with the Ausländerfeindlichkeit. It might have something to do with foreigner unfriendliness. Okay. How do you deal with that? Oh, the kind of like xenophobia or the kind of unfriendliness to. So I guess you're referring to the intimacy question? Exactly, yeah. So that's another one to consider. In fact, that's where we're going to go next, is how do you build intimacy in a culture where it's quite private, where privacy is valued, for example. You may have to stay on a level of cognitive intimacy. So here's my opinion and here's why I think so, for example. That already is showing more about who you are, what's underneath the surface of the water, than if you didn't say anything at all. In my clients in Germany often say, if I don't give you any feedback, that means everything is fine. Right? So no news is good news type thing. If something's wrong, I'll let you know. But otherwise, I'm happy. And that's fine if that's what people expect. But see, these expectations are also underneath the surface of the water. And that's something else that we have to discover in order to build that trust, in order to understand how do we work best with people. So I want to give you a chance that I trust you, right? And for you to trust them. How do you do that? So it's about being really clear about what are your expectations, saying them out loud so that people can meet them. Because usually what we do is we have an expectation, let's say, going back to that question of the high power distance and interaction in trainings, I may have an expectation that I ask a question in a meeting and I expect lots of answers. And when people don't do that, I think, oh, great, well, I can't trust these people to stand up in front of a client because clearly they're not able to even stand up in front of me. But the problem is I didn't ever let them know that I have an expectation that they answer my questions, even in a group environment. So I want to give them a chance that I trust them. You know what I'm saying? By being very clear about what I expect them to do. And on the other side of the coin, I want to ask what people expect of me. Like I said before, asking for feedback. How does the way I work impact you? Do I do anything that is surprising or disturbing for you? Because it might be a cultural thing. Could be. Here's a specific question. How do you gain credibility in a high power distance culture? So earlier I said credibility is one of the levers of building trust, right? So what do you think? Is it the same as gaining credibility in a low power distance culture? Think about that video clip we saw in India. Just handing over the business card with an impressive title already gained credibility. In a culture that has a high power distance, titles alone build credibility. If I come from a low power distance culture, authority to me, it's not that important. I feel like I'm able to speak up whether or not I have official authority. So I don't really worry about, making sure people understand what my status is. However, if I'm going to a culture where there's a high power distance and I just give it away inappropriately, I might be undermining my credibility. I might accidentally be sabotaging the trust that people have in me because I'm just, not even expecting people to notice my authority. I don't use my authority at all. Does that make sense? This is the part where I'm not used to the interaction. Yeah. So next one. What does self-orientation look like in a particularist culture? So if you remember, the particularist culture is that one where things are subjective, the laws apply, but if you have a certain circumstances, we might be able to overlook that. So what do you think? If you're from a universalist culture and you may be rule-oriented, sometimes that feels like self-orientation. So if I go to a particularist culture and I'm really, focused on the rules, the person from the particularist culture might say, hey, what about the relationship? Why is this person so fixated on the rules? Gosh, they care more about the rules and themselves than me. So it may have the same impact as self-orientation accidentally. And it might get in the way of trust if I'm not focusing enough on the relationship. And these are things that we don't even think about, but we might accidentally be doing. And how do you show up, or how do you show you're reliable in a monochronic culture? Right? You have to be really careful about what you promise, especially about timeliness. A lot of people think that, be 15 minutes early, exactly. A lot of people think that it takes a long time to build trust. And sure, of course it does. It takes time to build that deep trust. However, I want to challenge the notion that you absolutely need a long time to build trust, because what you can do is create opportunities to show that you're reliable. So if you want to build trust faster, especially in a monochronic culture, you can say, thank you for your request for proposal. I'll have it to you by 5 o'clock. And you have that thing in their inbox by 4:30. You just added a point for yourself as far as reliability goes. And for somebody, especially in a monochronic culture, that's a really important thing. Somebody in a polychronic culture, you may be able to show you're reliable by showing them that you're there for them when they need you, right? That you're gonna put aside whatever the task is at that moment and focus on them. Okay, we are running out of time. Thank you very much for the warning. And that is actually the last piece of information I have for you. I have a few book titles here and a full list of recommended reading, which I will just get to now. I'll leave that up and see if there's any other questions. I have a comment from the participants. When I worked in Norway, they wanted to know who I was. When I worked in Nigeria, they wanted to feel who I was. Very interesting. Yeah, so that's a nice example then. I'm also scrolling back to see what other questions may have come through that I might have missed. Please feel free to add your comments and questions at this time. There's a question, and this one is just to me, do we get the recording and the slides? Oh, and thank you, Juanita. This is being recorded, and I'm happy to share the slides. I actually don't. I'm going to ask you for that, Juanita. Do we officially have a procedure for that?
Sorry, I first had to unmute myself. I don't know if there's a recording. You can see that.
It is recording.
I can't see that.
Yeah, but, I did hit record.
Okay, great. I always forget it. So I can share that with people, and I can share the slides if it's not too heavy.
Well, with the movie, of course, but we could do a PDF version without the movie, just an image of the screenshot.
Exactly, and you can save also, for email. I don't know if you know that, but I can share it with you how you do that. Yeah, and then the presentation gets very light. Yeah, so I can share it. I just have to see how heavy the recording is. Yeah, my experience is the recordings are all, a lot of time very heavy. But I will check. I have all your email addresses, so I will send it to you through the PWN.
That's great. Yeah, at least then we can get the slides to people in PDF, and then the recording, we can see if maybe we can put a link to that somewhere. Exactly. Yeah, great. And thank you for that, Juanita. I'm going to see, I saw some questions coming through. First of all, would you expect that results get less controlled in a polychronic environment? That's an interesting question. That's kind of a dangerous question. I wouldn't want to say that they're less focused on results, because of course people certainly want to be able to, say that they're getting results and they're focusing on results. But I have a feeling it's just a lot more contextual. There's a context allowed. There's delays. There's things that had to come first. Priorities are different. So it might be less strictly controlled. Dare I be so absolute to say yes? I think that if you're coming from a monochronic culture, you would really have to be very, very clear about what kind of expectations you have regarding results. And of course, recognizing that your focus in being clear about those expectations may have an impact on that person, like, oh my God, they're so results driven. This person is not helping me build trust. So I think if I was going to give you advice, if that was an issue that you're facing, I would say, take some time to focus on the person in front of you before you get so clear about focusing on the results. Notice what is your own tendency. If you're more comfortable on the kind of task-oriented side and you want to do one thing after the next, recognize, okay, maybe actually there's some flexibility possible here, or you can have some sort of different way of timing things, some kind of sliding deadline, some kind of range of time for things to be ready. In my team, here's another question. In my team, my manager focuses more on strong and weak personalities. The stronger people need to be more sensitive to cultural needs of the weaker team members. How can I deal with this? That is a very tough question, because, boy, is it hard to say who's strong and who's weak. I guess what I'd like to hear from you, Ms. G, if you could if you could tell me what is the concern you have behind this. So do you feel like you're lumped in with the stronger people or the weaker people? And what exactly do you find, what exactly is the concern behind the question? Okay, so Miss G just wrote us back. She's lumped in with the stronger. So you feel like you're put an undue burden to deal with the sensitivities of some people in the team, is what I understand. And you don't feel like you need to be more sensitive than anybody else. Okay, yeah. You know what? I think that we cannot ever be held responsible for other people's feelings, in the sense of we can't control them. We should be respectful of other people's feelings, absolutely. And when I say respectful of people's feelings, we should be open to understand what our impact is and open to hear feedback from them about how we may have accidentally hurt their feelings, right? So, but we can't, as much as we would like to think that we can be nice and therefore people are happy, we may think we're being nice, and for whatever reason, that makes them mad, right? So it's like the only thing that we control is our own response and our own reaction and our own concerns and needs. So the what I would say in that situation is pay attention. Okay, what are my cultural needs, and what is my frame of reference? What is it? How do I view the situation? And am I aware of the fact that other people may be viewing it completely differently? What are my needs and concerns? If I feel like I'm not able to put my concerns on the table because some other people may be quote unquote weaker or more sensitive, then that becomes another concern for me that needs to be addressed. So focusing on learning how to be really clear about what are your needs and concerns, and learning how to articulate them in a way that is you're taking full ownership. And then getting curious, like role modeling that for those people around you to say, here are my concerns as a team member. I'm afraid I have so many, for example, here's an example. I have so many ideas and I'm so passionate about this topic. My urge is just to jump in immediately and give all my ideas. My concern is I might not be leaving enough space for the other people around the table. I would love people's feedback about that, or you could ask somebody specifically. That way you're not just tiptoeing around what you might think is offensive. Rather, you're putting that's what's going on underneath the surface of the water for you. They just see your behavior, and now what you've shown to them is the belief or the values or the passion that you have behind the behavior. And you're asking for feedback. That's all we can really do. Okay, I hope that answers your question, Ms. G. Here I saw another one coming in. Is Patrick Lencioni from the US or Italy? I believe he is an Italian American. That's the answer to that question. And so that's USA. And there's one more question which I'll answer, and now we need to close. The question is, at the beginning, Juanita said that the highest and lowest performing teams have the most cultural diversity. So what is the success behind aligning a culturally diverse team in the most effective way? Great, thank you. That's a nice bookend, Ms. K. So absolutely. The highest and lowest performing teams have the biggest diversity, not just cultural, by the way. It's also diversity in operating styles and any other kind of diversity you can think. So the key is the frame of reference. It's recognizing, hey, we do have diversity. What is the diversity? Where does it come from? That's really fascinating. I want to create a space for everybody to bring their diverse opinions and needs and share how they view the world through their frame of reference. And the successful managers and those successful teams that are diverse take the time and create the space for everybody to be able to contribute their diversity to the team. And those are the ones that can really profit from it. The ones that resist the differences are the ones that find themselves in conflict that doesn't get solved, and that blocks, like I was saying before, when you can't have conflict, then you can't have accountability, you can't have commitment, and those results start failing. So with that, we're going to bring this to a close, and I want to thank you very, very much for all the interactivity. I felt like, coming into this, I thought, how am I going to do this without being able to see people's faces? But having your responsiveness in the question box has been wonderful and has been a very enriching experience. So thank you for all your participation. And I hand it to you, Juanita, if you would like to say a few words.
Dear all, we are almost 20 minutes over time. Everyone stayed in, so I think you all agree with me that it was a magnificent webinar. This was Margot's first webinar, so I'm really impressed, Margot. Very well done. And I learned a lot. I have 3 pages of notes
Oh, good.
that I will use in my own life and with the people I meet daily. So thank you very much. Please all write some compliment and evaluation and feedback to Margot. I already see some responses. I think she deserves a big high up. Hand up. She did it great. Thank you so much, Margot. I promise you all to send you at least a presentation, and if possible, also the recording. I wish you all a good night and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Good evening.